As some of you may have noticed, I did a switcheroo, and it was just in my own mind that it seemed logical that Andrew Mitchell would take the panel, take the microphone last, being the one to explain how the most important country in the world will resolve all of the concerns raised by the former speakers. And we'll do it that way because I would now like to give the podium to Fyodor Lukyanov. Fyodor and I, we go back a long time, and I say I don't think we could have any better representative of Russia to enlighten us here today. Fyodor, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm very glad and honored to be here. I tried to come to this conference last year, but due to several circumstances, I failed to do it. But now I see that it's worth visiting anyway. Not only debate and scientific depth, but also view. So my introduction is modestly called in the program as Russian Perspective. This is because I was lazy enough to send a better title. And actually, this title is not fully okay, because there is no perspective which could be called Russian. There are multiple Russian perspectives nowadays. Maybe it might sound as a surprise to some of you, because those who read press, Western press about Russia, they can imagine a very mobilized, very committed country which really has a goal to destroy Western democracies, and everybody in Russia knows how to do it. And what should be done just now, unfortunately, is not the case, because in fact, Russian political community and strategic community, all those dealing with foreign policy and international affairs, are as confused as anybody else in the world. Everything is changing. We feel it on day-to-day basis. And actually, we have an extremely complicated intellectual landscape in Russia nowadays, which is a combination of very different pieces, partly perceptions and ideas from the past, from different periods of the past, which people try to apply to today's situation. Most of them don't match exactly. There are also, of course, what we started to discuss in the first session, many interesting ideas and fantasies about technological future, but unfortunately the problem with those is that no one actually knows exactly how it will evolve. So we can have a lot of brilliant ideas, but it's just literature mostly. So in this regard, what I'm saying is not a Russian perspective. This is an attempt to express an atmosphere in Russian political debate. And due to my work, I'm placed very much in the middle of this debate. So I think I can give some outlines to you. So. First of all, talking about the title of our panel, about abdication from the throne, I think it's quite important to note that in Russia, very little people believe that there is any abdication of the West. Of course, there are discussions, and it's very interesting to follow political development in the United States or in Britain nowadays. But in general, you will not find many people in Russia who would say, okay, the West is done, now let's imagine something else. In fact, what happens in Russian relationship with outside world, it does not correspond to the idea of abdication of the West. NATO is keeping enlarging. We see new member states to join. Sanctions are being imposed almost on monthly, if not weekly basis. So in this regard, not so much changed in Russia compared to the period when the West, okay, let's say, was stably on the throne. So in this regard, maybe Russia is one of countries where mighty of the West, and especially of the United States, is still appreciated much higher than in the West itself. If we still would assume, following the title of the panel, that the abdicating is happening, it's the case. So in fact, it puts Russia in a pretty complicated situation. One of the most significant thinkers in international affairs in the late Soviet time, a member of Russian Academy of Science and long-term advisor to Russian Soviet leaders, Georgy Arbatov, said early 1990s, talking to American counterparts with whom he had a lot of discussions about any strategic things for years, he said, you know, we did the worst thing to you. We deprived you from the enemy. And at that time, it was perceived by many people as a joke. But actually, he was quite a smart person, and he understood that the system, to a certain extent, success of the West in the second half of 20th century was structurally based on the Cold War and necessity to confront the Soviet Union. And when Soviet Union abdicated from the throne, that was a big strategic change, which initially generated a big euphoria, but now we see that euphoria is being replaced by something else. So what is happening now to Russia? If we assume that the West is abdicating, then we are in certain regard in the same situation. Because Russian policy, since, I don't know, Peter the Great at least, was basically entirely Western-centric. Western-centric does not mean pro or contra. It might be both. But the West has always been the reference point to any strategic thinking and even internal domestic thinking, because Europe as an idea and the West as an idea has played very important role in Russian intellectual life since maybe early 19th century and until now. So in this regard, Russians got used to the world where the West is on the throne, or at least is the main actor, the dominating force. And now it is changing. So I will not go back too long to history, but if we just take the period after the Cold War, so putting aside a lot of rhetorics and many extravagant discussion we always have in our country, I think that the two real models of Russian presence in the world, which were not discussed but were considered as options. Discussions were about many things, but real options. Both of them were connected to Western presence in international politics as the main player. One idea, one model was immediately after collapse of the Soviet Union, and this idea was shared by both Western side and then time Russian leadership, that Russia should become, so to say, part of an extended West on certain conditions. Conditions changed with time, perception of conditions changed with time, but anyway, it was no idea that Russia should be something opposed to this new Western community, but of course Russia could never expect and was never seen as a country which can be just integral part of that. So it was quite complicated situation. But during 1990s and even in 2000s, when President Putin was already in place, that was basically the leading idea, how to accommodate Russian interest into Western sphere. And of course, since 1990s, we had plenty of different discussion, in particular about multipolar world. And one of the biggest Russian political thinkers of recent period, Evgeny Primakov, was the first person in 96, when he started to talk about multipolarity, about necessity to counterbalance American dominance in the world. But it was never seen as a practical option, actually. It was like a necessary attempt to balance, but not to actually to offer a concrete world order alternative to the Western one. And the second option, which might be identified, that was later when illusions about hypothetical Russian integration into Western community started to be quite clear. That was an idea about something like a balanced cooperation, rival relationship with the United States, something like a light version of the Cold War. And I think that in second half of 2000s and beginning of this decade, that was something which was not formulated in concepts, but more or less occupied minds of many Russian thinkers. So now the multipolarity is there. And it's, for Russia, I think it's a very clear example of this famous warning, be afraid that your dreams come true. So in fact, now for Russia, situation, international situation is maybe the least favorable, because we have political multipolarity, it's quite obvious, be it because abdication of the West, or rather me as a person who still studied in the Soviet Union, I was obliged to study Marxism, and according to Marxist view, it's not abdication, it's just a natural development of history when leaders will be changed because of socio-political changes. So anyway, this is multipolar situation politically. This is very complicated, diversified, disbalanced situation economically, with a big part of mercantilism and protectionist feelings coming up. And this is still financial hegemony and financial monopoly of the United States. And this is a very, very complicated and diverse situation, which is producing what is called now the fashionable notion. No one can describe it clearly, but the fashionable notion of hybrid everything. Hybrid policy, hybrid economy, hybrid everything. This is because the complete disbalance of the system, because players, actors with particular aspects of influence and force, they try to compensate by this force which they don't have, and we see what it brings. So Russia is on the brink to completely new period, both domestically and internationally. Domestically, it's quite obvious that the long time of presidency of Mr. Putin is about to start to come to an end, not soon, not immediately, but it's quite obvious that change is inevitable. And in our case, it will not mean just change of person, it will be significant change of political model. At the same time, Russia is being situated in a world which is changing every day. And Russia is, in this regard, in the same position as everybody else, that no one can clearly understand what will happen tomorrow. What is more or less common wisdom in Russian political discussion, in Russian intellectual debate about principles of the future world? It's not a model, because it would be great if Russia could offer a new world order, a concept of a new world order, but I don't think it's the case. As I don't think it's the case of China, because it's not a formulated idea which China can offer. But what is more or less accepted in Russian discussion is that world tomorrow, for quite a long time, will be very fluid and flexible, which means, first of all, sorry to say it at this conference dedicated to Atlantic cooperation, which means that firm alliances are, so to say, not the format of the future. And rather, what Mr. Rumsfeld called 2001 coalitions of the willing, or what was his phrase, mission defines coalition. We see more and more of that. And in this regard, NATO, which was seen, say, 10, 15 years ago, even in Russia, as a model, as a prototype for future alliances and relationships, is not seen in this way anymore. So the abdication of the West, let's assume that it's happening, puts Russia in a completely new position, because this multipolar world, as President Putin once noted in a public speech, is not a solution per se. It's just multipolar world, in fact, is much less stable and more unpredictable than anybody else. But this is fact of life. So Russia is in a state of confusion, in a state of reflection, and of course it's extremely sad that this reflection is more and more separated from reflection here. I think that at the end of the day we will need to try to look at the past, because most of our fatal contradictions today are rooted in the recent past, so we will be able to look at the past through more realistic and less emotional lenses. And I think to conclude, 2019 is a very good year to start to think, because there's 30 years since big revolution in Eastern Europe and changes which happened all over the world. And this is, to me, it's underestimated watershed, because policies both in the West and in Russia are defined by that period. But we see this time in a completely different way. What was for the West liberation, unification, and so on, for our country was beginning of decline and collapse. And it's not, unfortunately, it's not the case that somebody is right and somebody else is wrong. So in a way, the Cold War, maybe I can sound very paradoxical, but the Cold War was a joint venture. The Cold War was much more, much better time in order to formulate rules of the game, ways to cooperate, formats. So because everybody knew each other from opposite poles, but anyway. When I now see at much younger people, those who were born after, those who don't remember the Cold War in Russia and in the West, I understand that unlike elder generation who had this common ground, they don't have it, because the reference point is completely different. And I think what we need to do, actually not to just discuss how the West is abdicating or how to come back to the throne, but really to start to discuss recent past and experience which should be turned into common experience again and not experience against each other. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Fyodor.